Have you ever been accused of a crime you didn't commit? Imagine this. You're driving home after a long day, just 20 minutes away from kicking off your tie, sinking into your seat and enjoying some peace. But then, the flashing red and blue lights appear in your rearview mirror. Your heart skips a beat. A routine stop? Or the beginning of a nightmare? You're doing everything by the book. But in the blink of an eye, you're searched, handcuffed, and hauled to the station like a criminal. You look around, seeing the fluorescent lights flickering against the cold walls, and the only question racing through your mind, why is this happening to me? What if power is no longer a shield? What if the truth can expose those who abuse it? Do you think this only happens in movies? Watch the story of Matthew Lee, a man they thought was an easy target, until they discovered who he really was. Comment below, what would you do if you were falsely accused right on the street? And don't forget to follow so you don't miss these intense, jaw-dropping twists. The nightmare begins on an ordinary night. Matthew Lee leaned back in his seat, letting out a deep breath. Finally, it was over. The last 3 days had been a whirlwind of tense meetings, strategic handshakes, and decisions that could change everything. But now all he wanted was to get home. The black Lexus cruised smoothly down the empty highway, the engine's low hum blending into the stillness of the night. The rear-view mirror reflected his eyes, tired yet sharp. Counterintelligence at the CIA wasn't a job for the faint of heart. It required patience, split-second decisions, and sometimes choices no one ever wanted to make. Matthew loosened his tie, glancing at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Only 20 minutes left. Everything was under control, until the flashing lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Red and blue. His heart skipped a beat. A routine stop? A night patrol cop? Nothing unusual, but the feeling in Matthew's chest told him this wasn't just a random check. He sighed, signaling and slowly pulling over. A brief moment of discomfort crossed his mind. His car had just been serviced. There couldn't be any issues. The CIA badge was still in his jacket pocket. But tonight, it wouldn't help, because the officers stepping out of the patrol car weren't seeking justice. They were looking for a victim. Everything would change in the next few minutes, and they had no idea they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. Matthew Lee relaxed his hands on the steering wheel, feeling his heartbeat slow down. He had faced far more intense situations than this. Missions infiltrating dangerous organizations, decoding secrets that could spark wars. But a late-night traffic stop on an empty road? That made him uneasy. The window of the car rolled down slowly, the bright flashlight beam shining directly into his eyes. "Where are you headed tonight?" The first officer's voice was calm, but there was a hint of intent. Matthew didn't blink. "I'm headed home." The officer glanced over to his partner, standing just behind him, hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Do you know why we stopped your car?" Matthew shook his head. "Your taillight is broken." His heart skipped a beat. No way. The car had just been serviced before the trip. Everything was perfect. But he didn't argue. He didn't protest. He knew this wasn't about a taillight. "Step out of the car." No explanation. No warning. Just a heavy, empty command. Matthew stared straight into their eyes, searching for a clue. He had no choice. Refusing meant resisting. Complying meant offering himself up as prey. The car door opened, and the night air was colder than he expected. Standing on the asphalt, Matthew felt something wrong. "You seem tense." The second officer chuckled, circling him like a predator. The trap had been set, and even though Matthew knew he was about to be pulled into a dirty game, he had no way to stop it. When you're accused, and there's no way to prove your innocence. Matthew Lee stood still by his Lexus, his hands loosely at his sides. His palms weren't sweaty, his heartbeat steady, but he knew this wasn't just a routine check. The first officer leaned down, shining the flashlight inside the car. "Mind if we take a look inside your car?" Matthew didn't respond immediately. This was a trap. If he refused, they'd assume he was hiding something. If he agreed, they'd rummage until they found what they were looking for. Either way, he was already lost the moment he was forced into this game. A soft sigh escaped his lips. "Go ahead." They wasted no time. The leather seats were flipped. The glove compartment opened with an urgency that wasn't even trying to hide itself. His paperwork was tossed to the floor, a water bottle shoved aside. Then, one of the officers froze. Found it! A small pill bottle rested neatly in his hand. The label had faded over time, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they now had their excuse. "What's this, Mr. Lee?" The officer's tone pretended to be friendly, but his gaze was sharp as a knife. Matthew stared back at them. They knew he couldn't answer in a way that would help him. And then, a click. Cold. Tight. The handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. "You're under arrest for illegal possession." Everything happened too fast, but it wasn't a surprise. Matthew had known from the moment the red and blue lights flickered in his rearview mirror that tonight he wasn't going home. What would you do if you were treated like a criminal, with no way to prove your innocence? The cold, tight grip of the handcuffs snapped around Matthew Lee's wrists. Cold. Hard. Not because of the metal, but because of the harsh reality they represented. In this moment, he was no longer a citizen, no longer an agent. He was just another name on the list of those with issues. The two officers gripped his arms tightly, dragging him toward the patrol car. His black Lexus was still there, the headlights faintly flickering, as if even the car couldn't understand what had just happened. Matthew didn't resist. He knew the game. The more you resist, the more reasons they have. But that didn't make the simmering anger inside him any less intense. The police car door slammed shut. The space felt cramped, the air suffocating. He had been in more intense situations than this, on real battlefronts, facing real threats. But tonight, what terrified him the most were the uniforms of the people driving him away. At the police station, they treated him like any other person arrested in the middle of the night. Mugshot, fingerprints, seizing personal belongings. "You have the right to remain silent." Matthew let out a wry laugh. They thought they could control this story. A cold, fluorescent-lit cell, the gray concrete walls flickering. One man sat silently in the corner, another pacing back and forth, muttering something to himself. Matthew leaned back against the wall, relaxing. He could wait. They thought they had control, but they didn't know they had just arrested the wrong man. They didn't know that tonight, everything would change. When truth doesn't matter, only confessions will do. Matthew Lee sat back in the cold metal chair, his hands resting on the table. No chains, no violence. But it was still a prison. In front of him, the two officers from the traffic stop earlier. One leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to appear calm. The other, Officer Daniels, sat down, flipping through a file. "You can make this easier, Lee," Daniels said, tapping his pen on the table. "Just admit that you refuse to cooperate, that you seem nervous, that you have something to hide." Matthew remained silent. Daniels leaned forward. "You know how this ends, right? A guilty record, a fine, maybe a bit of probation. Or," he paused, a smug smile forming, "or you can fight the system. But I promise you, the system always wins." Matthew blinked slowly. The system? He had seen real systems. Complex spy networks, governments operating on razor-thin margins. And he knew. Every system had its flaws. He leaned forward, his voice steady and calm. "I want my lawyer." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Daniels clenched his pen. Officer Reynolds shuddered slightly, because now they understood. Matthew Lee wasn't an easy target. Daniels sighed, throwing the pen down on the table. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Matthew smiled coldly but with certainty. "Pretty sure." They thought they had control, but the truth was, they were the ones playing a game they had already lost from the first move. Matthew Lee in the courtroom. Matthew Lee sat still in the defendant's chair, hands interlocked, his gaze sharp but calm. He had sat across from real threats, terrorists, double agents, politicians who could bend the truth with a perfect lie. But tonight, in this courtroom, the two officers standing before the jury were the most professional liars of all. "Officer Daniels, can you recount what happened that night?" the prosecutor asked, his tone authoritative. The officer cleared his throat, standing tall. "We noticed the defendant displaying suspicious behavior while driving. When we stopped, he appeared nervous, avoided eye contact, and his hands were trembling. When we asked to search the vehicle, he was uncooperative. Matthew almost laughed. They were really selling their story. And did you find anything suspicious? Daniels nodded firmly. Yes, a bottle of unmarked pills. When we asked about it, he refused to answer. Then he became combative when we proceeded with the arrest. The jury listened intently, some nodding, taking notes. Others studied Matthew's expression, perhaps looking for signs of the aggression they had just heard about. But Matthew just sat there, calm. They didn't know the game was already over. The prosecutor turned to the second officer. Officer Reynolds, do you agree with your colleague's testimony? Reynolds glanced briefly at Daniels before nodding. I completely agree. Everything we did was in the interest of public safety. Public safety. Matthew squinted. How many innocent people had been caught in this game? How many lives had been stolen by cleverly spun lies? He glanced at his lawyer. She nodded slightly. It was time. Matthew slowly stood up, pulling a sleek black ID card from his jacket pocket. Wordlessly, he handed it to the prosecutor. The man furrowed his brow, walked over, took it, and immediately froze. Everything in the courtroom fell into complete silence. The prosecutor swallowed, turning to the judge. His voice had gone hoarse. Mr. Lee, please confirm your identity. Matthew looked directly at the two officers, his voice steady. CIA counterintelligence. Daniels went pale. Reynolds froze, and in that moment, the story they had carefully orchestrated began to unravel. The truth has more power than any lie, but sometimes it needs the right moment to reveal itself. The atmosphere in the courtroom suddenly froze. It felt as though all sound had been sucked out of the room. 1 second, Matthew Lee was just a defendant being cornered. The next, the entire courtroom felt the impact of a heavy shock. CIA counterintelligence. 3 words. No further explanation needed. The prosecutor blinked, briefly swaying as if someone had just yanked the rug out from under him. The jury, once skeptical, now shifted into a state of alert. The 2 officers standing at the witness stand no longer looked confident. Matthew didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The truth had just been dropped into the room like a ticking time bomb, and everyone could feel its explosive force. The judge removed his glasses, sighed, his gaze piercing the prosecutor. Can you verify this? The prosecutor quickly flipped through the file that Matthew's lawyer had just handed him, scanning the lines, the stamps, the high-level security certifications. Then he swallowed hard, his face going stiff. From that moment on, the entire trajectory of the case had changed. Daniels and Reynolds still stood there, but now they weren't the accusers. They were the ones about to be judged. Mr. Lee, the judge turned to Matthew, his voice lowering. Would you like to make a statement before we proceed? Matthew slowly stood, his gaze sweeping across the jury before stopping on the 2 officers. I just have one question. He tilted his head. Do either of you want to amend your testimony? The entire courtroom held its breath. Reynolds instinctively shifted, pressing his lips together. Daniels gripped the armrest, his jaw tightening. They knew. They had lost. But what they didn't know was that their real nightmare had only just begun. When the veil of lies fell, the truth would crush those who couldn't face it. Daniels swallowed. Reynolds shifted in his seat, but his eyes no longer held the same hard edge. They were no longer the officers in control of the trial. Now they were the prey in a trap. The judge stared at them, his gaze sharp. Do you wish to amend your testimony? No response, only silence. That silence spoke volumes. The judge lowered his glasses, his voice cold. Court clerk, initiate an internal investigation request. The atmosphere in the room thickened. This was no simple case of wrongful arrest. This was a systematic conspiracy. The prosecutor quietly withdrew, understanding that the battle had been lost. The jury whispered among themselves, no longer seeing Matthew as the defendant. They saw him as a survivor. Daniels and Reynolds didn't say a word. They knew their lives would never be the same again. Justice doesn't always come immediately, but once it's set in motion, no one can stop it. 3 weeks after the trial, the names Daniels and Reynolds were all over the headlines, not as law enforcement officers, but as abusers of power exposed for their wrongdoings. Daniels, who once stood tall in the courtroom, quietly submitted his resignation. He knew he had no choice. An internal hearing would only make things worse. Leaving quietly was better than being exposed to the public. Reynolds, less fortunate, was immediately suspended. A thorough investigation uncovered a series of forged reports, coercion, and illegal arrests spanning years. Ultimately, his badge was stripped from him right in front of his colleagues. Matthew Lee stood in front of his office, watching the news on the screen. He didn't feel triumphant. Not at all, because he knew this wasn't just his story. How many others had been caught in this game? How many lives had been ruined by people like Daniels and Reynolds? The answer might lie in the next files he was about to open, and this time he wouldn't stop. The truth may be hidden for a time, but never forever. Matthew Lee flipped through the files on his desk, each line cutting deep into his patience like a sharp knife. It wasn't just about him. Dozens of names, dozens of lives. People who had been stopped by Daniels and Reynolds, searched, accused of crimes they didn't commit. Some lost their jobs because of tarnished records. Some lost their freedom because they couldn't afford a lawyer to defend themselves. And some lost everything. Matthew clenched his fist, a simmering anger rising in his chest. They thought the system would always protect them, but the truth was, the system only protects those who know how to fight back. The phone on his desk buzzed. His lawyer. "What can we do about this?" Her voice wasn't as professional as usual. It was filled with raw fury. Matthew closed his eyes, took a deep breath. This was no longer just a personal case. This was a larger battle. He opened his eyes, his voice low but firm. "We're not going to let this happen again. The system never fails. It only fails those who don't have power." Matthew Lee silently read the files in his hands. Each page was a story. A man sent to prison simply for refusing to let the police search his car without just cause. A single mother who lost her job because of a false accusation, her record forever stained. A young student whose future was destroyed because he was falsely accused of drug possession, just because he couldn't resist. Numbers don't lie, but the people behind the system do. Matthew closed his eyes. He had once believed that justice could be balanced. But justice isn't a thing. It depends on the people who enforce it. And when those in power choose to distort the truth for their own gain, those who are vulnerable have two choices: endure or fight. He opened his eyes and turned to the last page. The price of silence was too high. His phone buzzed again. His lawyer's voice came through the line. "We're going to overturn all of these cases. Are you ready?" Matthew gripped the files in his hand. They thought they had won, but the game had only just begun. Justice cannot be bought with money. The thick envelope lay on the table. A 7-figure sum, a settlement offer, a way for the city to silence the issue before it became a media storm. Matthew Lee stared at it for a few seconds, then scoffed. Did they really think this was what he wanted? A check to erase what had happened? To let the other victims sink into the shadows as if nothing ever happened? His lawyer sat next to him, arms crossed, waiting for his answer. "This amount could make you walk away from this fight and move on with your life," she said, but her eyes made it clear she knew the answer. Matthew leaned forward, interlocking his hands. "Do they think money can fix injustice?" He pushed the envelope forward. "Tell them I don't want the money." The silence stretched on. His lawyer nodded, unsurprised. Matthew took a deep breath, his eyes cold and sharp. "I want change. The only way to win this game is to break it entirely. Change doesn't come from apologies. It comes from action." Matthew Lee stood before the city council, his gaze unwavering. They thought he would accept the money and walk away in silence. But he wasn't here for himself. He was here for those who had lost their voice. A settlement can't erase the years someone lost behind bars for a wrongful accusation. His voice was low but strong. It can't give back the jobs of those who were pushed out of society simply because they crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong time. Silence filled the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They didn't want to hear this, but they couldn't ignore it. "I don't want money, I want change." Matthew looked each council member in the eye. "I want an overhaul. I want a more rigorous selection process, higher accountability training, and policies to protect citizens from abuse of power. Some sighed, others scribbled notes. But he saw it, a crack in the system, a sign of instability, and he wouldn't stop, not until these changes became reality. Truth doesn't change the world by itself, but those willing to act on it can. Matthew Lee looked out the window, the city lights reflecting on the glass. He had fought, exposed the lies, but this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The system is strong when no one questions it, when people accept injustice as part of life, when those in power believe they can do whatever they want without anyone holding them accountable. But what happens if we stop being silent? What if we speak up? What if we demand transparency? What if we don't just hear this story and forget, but share it so that others can see the truth? The question isn't, what if this happened to me? It's, how many others have gone through this without the chance to speak up? They say justice is blind. But if we open our eyes, if we collectively question it, maybe for the first time in a long time, justice will truly be seen. Don't stay silent. Share. Ask questions. Demand the truth. Because change only happens when someone dares to begin.